My parents offered my boyfriend $15,000 to leave me, so I cut them off and built a life they'll never touch. And when that insane spring storm hit Savannah, I wasn't even supposed to be downtown, but my class ran late, and by the time I finished, my rideshare app completely failed on me. No drivers available, just endless loading screens while the rain hammered down so hard it was like the sky had split open. I ducked into the first place I saw, a tiny old record store squeezed between a pawn shop and a bakery, the kind of place that smelled like damp cardboard, ancient vinyl, and a little bit of cinnamon from next door. I was dripping wet, no umbrella, no jacket, clutching my tote bag to my chest like it might somehow keep me dry, and feeling like the world's biggest idiot for not checking the weather that morning. I was hovering by a rack of old jazz albums, trying not to leave a puddle on the floor, when I heard a voice behind me say, "If you're going to flood the place, at least buy something first." And when I turned around, there he was. Drew wasn't some polished, preppy guy like the ones my mother always tried to steer me toward. He had messy brown hair pushed back with his fingers, a faint scar on his chin like he'd gotten into a fight with a fence as a kid, and this easy, crooked grin that made my stomach do an immediate somersault. I probably looked like a half-drowned cat, but he didn't seem to care, just started chatting like it was the most normal thing in the world to talk to strangers who were dripping all over your workplace. We ended up talking for almost an hour, about music at first because that was easy, but then somehow about cartoons we watched as kids, the best cereal brands, ridiculous childhood injuries, and by the time the rain finally let up, it felt like I'd known him for way longer than 55 minutes. When I tried to leave, apologizing for the mess I'd made, he just laughed and handed me a battered old umbrella from behind the counter, saying he only lived a few blocks away and didn't need it, that I could bring it back sometime if I wanted, no pressure. It was the most low-key way anyone had ever asked for my number, so obviously I gave it to him, heart hammering in my chest like a drum solo gone wrong, trying to play it cool, but probably failing miserably. I spent the whole trolley ride home twirling that stupid umbrella between my fingers, wondering if he would actually text me or if I'd just imagined the connection. He texted that night, just a dumb meme about soggy cats, and somehow that led to 3 hours of texting back and forth until my phone died in my hand around 3 in the morning. Our first date wasn't some fancy restaurant with candles and awkward small talk like I'd been conditioned to expect. It was coffee at a hole-in-the-wall diner 2 blocks from his apartment, where we spent 2 hours arguing passionately about whether waffles or pancakes were superior. Drew had this way of making everything feel easy, no games, no performance, just pure unfiltered honesty that I didn't even realize I'd been starving for until I met him. Within a month, I was spending more time at his apartment than my own, getting to know his tiny, chaotic life, full of chipped mugs and secondhand furniture and a laugh that made the worst days seem survivable. The problem, of course, was my family. My parents, Gloria and Harold, weren't exactly snobs in the country club, pearls and white gloves sense, but they had expectations, the kind you could feel hanging in the air like humidity whenever you brought home someone they hadn't handpicked for you. They paid for my private high school, my tuition at Savannah School of Design, my first car, my health insurance, and in their minds, that meant they had a say in everything else too. When I mentioned Drew to them for the first time, I saw it immediately, that flicker of skepticism, my mother's tight smile, my father's polite but too interested questions about Drew's background, where he went to school, what his parents did, whether he had ambitions. I told them he worked at a record shop and was saving to finish his business degree at community college, that his mom was a nurse's aide who raised him by herself, and watched as my mother's face pinched just slightly, like she'd bitten into something sour but was too polite to spit it out. They said all the right things at first. "Can't wait to meet him. We're so happy for you. You seem really happy." But the second the call ended, I had this sinking feeling in my stomach, the one you get when you know a storm's coming but there's nothing you can do to stop it. The first dinner was a disaster from the jump. My mother wore pearls so tight around her neck I swear I heard them creak, and my father opened a bottle of wine older than me and poured Drew a glass before accidentally, tipping half of it down his shirt barely 10 minutes into the evening. Drew laughed it off, made a joke about it being an upgrade to his wardrobe, but I could see the flicker of embarrassment in his eyes and hated my parents a little for it. 2 weeks later, at another casual dinner, it happened again. A second spill, same clumsy apology, same tight smiles, and I knew then that it wasn't an accident at all, just a passive-aggressive way to mark him as less than, without ever having to say it out loud. It only escalated from there. My mother started sending me articles about how relationships at my age never lasted, links to dating apps full of clean-cut men with MBA degrees and shiny futures. And when I borrowed her tablet one afternoon to look up a recipe, I found 3 dating profiles she'd made for me, complete with cringy bios about my love for luxury and desire for a strong, successful partner, all with recent photos she must have yanked from my Instagram. When I confronted her, she had the nerve to say she was just keeping my options open, like my relationship was some clearance item she could swap out if something shinier came along. Drew never complained, never fought back, just kept showing up, kept smiling, kept treating me like I was the most important person in the world, but I could feel the weight of it starting to drag him down. One night, after another brutal dinner where my father grilled him about the future of retail in the age of Amazon like Drew was defending a dissertation, he was quiet the whole drive home, just staring out the window while I tried to fill the silence with stupid chatter about a movie I wanted to see. When I finally asked what was wrong, he just shook his head and said, "I don't think your parents will ever see me as good enough for you." And my heart broke into 1,000 pieces right there in the car. I knew I had to make a choice eventually, that trying to live with one foot in each world would tear me apart sooner or later, but part of me kept hoping it wouldn't come to that if I just held on long enough, maybe they'd see what I saw in him. Maybe they'd realize that kindness mattered more than connections, that love was more important than lineage, that building a life together meant a hell of a lot more than just blending 2 family trees into one big impressive oak. But I was wrong, so wrong. And the worst part was, I hadn't even seen how bad it could get yet. The night everything truly started unraveling, I was at my parents' house helping my mom set up some new kitchen gadgets she'd ordered online because apparently, despite having 2 college degrees, she can't operate anything more complicated than a toaster. Drew wasn't with me that night because he had picked up a last-minute shift at the record store to cover for a sick coworker, and honestly, part of me was relieved he wasn't there, because even the thought of another strained evening full of judgmental comments and passive-aggressive digs made my stomach twist into knots. I was standing in the kitchen, elbow deep in bubble wrap, when I heard my parents talking in the next room, and I swear to God, if I hadn't heard it with my own ears, I wouldn't have believed it. My dad, in that slow, deliberate voice he always uses when he's pretending he's being reasonable, said something like, "If Drew's half as smart as he seems, he'll take the offer and disappear before things get any more complicated." My mom didn't even hesitate before agreeing, saying she was worried I was becoming too emotionally invested, and that if we didn't act soon, there would be no saving me from making a terrible mistake. I froze completely, bubble wrap crackling in my clenched fists, and when I peeked around the corner, I saw my dad holding a manila envelope, thick enough that even from a distance I knew there was a serious amount of cash or a check inside. I dropped the bubble wrap so fast it startled both of them, and when they looked up and saw me standing there, red-faced and shaking, they had the audacity to act like I was the one being unreasonable. My mom rushed over, babbling about how they were only trying to help me see reason, and my dad just stood there looking disappointed, like I'd somehow failed a test I didn't even know I was taking. I don't even remember what I screamed at them because my head was pounding so hard I could barely hear myself. But I do remember that when I stormed out the door, my father actually had the nerve to shout after me that I was being emotional and short-sighted, and that I would regret throwing away my future for someone who would never be able to offer me a stable life. When I told Drew what happened, he looked devastated but not surprised, like a part of him had been waiting for the other shoe to drop this whole time. That night, we stayed up until almost dawn, talking in circles about what to do, whether it was even possible to keep trying to bridge a gap so wide it felt like a canyon. Drew, being the stubborn idiot I love, actually suggested maybe we should take a step back, give my parents time to cool off, See if space would make them realize how ridiculous they were being. But I knew better. My parents aren't the type to change their minds once they've decided they're right about something. They'll dig in their heels and destroy everything before admitting even a shred of doubt. Sure enough, 2 days later, I got an official letter from my university's financial office saying that the payment plan my parents had set up for my final semester had been canceled, leaving a massive, unpaid balance hanging over my head like a guillotine. I called my mom in a panic, hoping, praying maybe there had been a mistake, that maybe they hadn't actually meant it. But she just sighed and said that until I came to my senses, they couldn't in good conscience continue funding a lifestyle they didn't approve of. I wanted to throw the phone across the room. Instead, I thanked her in the coldest voice I could manage, hung up, and immediately burst into tears right there on the cracked vinyl floor of Drew's tiny kitchen. That was the moment I realized there was no middle ground anymore. I couldn't keep trying to straddle both worlds. Couldn't keep hoping that if I just said the right words or made the right choices, my parents would suddenly see the light. They weren't interested in compromise. They wanted control, and when they couldn't have it, they wanted to punish me until I broke. But I wasn't going to break. Not for them. Not for anyone. Drew offered to loan me the money to finish school, but there was no way I was going to start our future with that kind of debt hanging over us. Instead, I threw myself into applying for emergency aid, grants, anything that might buy me enough time to finish my degree. I picked up extra freelance gigs, started working night shifts at a grimy little diner near campus, anything to keep myself afloat. There were nights I came home so exhausted I couldn't even undress properly before collapsing into bed, still wearing my apron, smelling like fried onions and despair. Meanwhile, Drew worked even harder, picking up extra shifts wherever he could, even taking a second job doing deliveries for a local flower shop just to scrape together enough for our rent. We barely saw each other during those weeks, passing like ships in the night, leaving each other notes on the fridge or texts that just said, "Miss you," or "Be safe." Some days, the only time I heard his voice was the 30 seconds before I fell asleep, when he kissed my forehead and whispered that he loved me. I could feel the cracks starting to form, not between Drew and me, but between the version of myself I used to be and the one I was becoming. The old me, the one who never had to worry about money or stability, who could afford to spend an afternoon wandering the city buying overpriced coffee and designer notebooks. That girl was gone, burned away by the harsh reality of rent payments and student loan bills and the constant, gnawing fear that no matter how hard I worked, it would never be enough. But the new me, the one rising from the ashes, was tougher than I ever thought possible. I learned how to stretch $20 across a week, how to make meals out of canned beans and whatever was on sale, how to walk past shiny store windows without even flinching. I learned how to say no, how to stand my ground even when my voice shook, how to look my parents in the eye and see them not as gods, but as deeply flawed, frightened people who were willing to destroy their own daughter's happiness just to maintain their illusion of control. The worst day came when I got a call from my younger sister Rose, who still lived at home. She whispered that she had overheard my parents talking again, planning to try a different tactic to bring me to my senses. My father's idea was to throw me a surprise engagement party with some random guy from their social circle, hoping the public pressure would make me rethink my relationship with Drew. I hung up the phone shaking so hard I could barely breathe, heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. That night, Drew found me sitting on the floor in our tiny living room, surrounded by unopened bills and half-finished assignments, tears streaming down my face. He sat down next to me, didn't say anything for a long time, just wrapped his arms around me and held on tight. When I finally stopped shaking, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "We can do this, Callie. We can survive this, but only if we're on the same team." I nodded because even though the thought of what we were up against terrified me, even though part of me still ached for the life I'd left behind, I knew he was right. It was us against the world now. And if my parents thought a few checks and some cruel words were enough to break me, they were about to find out just how stubborn their daughter could really be. It took less than a week for my parents to escalate their war against my happiness to levels I didn't even know they were capable of, like they realized that cutting off my tuition hadn't broken me fast enough, so they needed to bring out the heavy artillery. It started with texts from my mom, dozens of them a day, each one carefully crafted to sound concerned and loving on the surface, but dripping with judgment if you read between the lines. Like when she sent me an article titled, "How Early Romantic Attachments Can Sabotage Career Aspirations," with a cheerful, "Thought this was interesting," at the end. My dad didn't bother pretending anymore, sending blunt messages about how he still had contacts at several firms and could easily set me up with someone more appropriate if I was ready to come home and be sensible. Meanwhile, I was drowning in work, stress, and exhaustion, juggling freelance deadlines with my shifts at the diner and trying to keep my grades from tanking completely, because if I failed even one class, I'd have to come back for another semester I couldn't afford. Drew was killing himself too, working 6 or 7 days a week between the record store and delivery jobs, coming home so late some nights that I was already asleep on the couch, still clutching my laptop or a half-eaten sandwich. We barely had time to breathe, let alone talk about the bigger questions hanging over us, like where we would live after my lease ended, or how we were supposed to build a future on 2 overdrawn bank accounts and a dream. The worst part was seeing what it was doing to Drew, because even though he tried so hard to be strong for me, to pretend like it didn't hurt that my parents saw him as nothing more than a temporary distraction, I could see it eating away at him in the quiet moments. The way his shoulders slumped when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he hesitated sometimes before reaching for my hand in public, like he was afraid of being reminded again that he didn't belong in my world. It broke my heart because if anyone deserved to feel like he was enough, it was Drew, who showed up for me every single day without expecting anything in return except maybe a smile or a dumb meme texted during a lunch break. And then came the final blow, the thing that pushed everything from barely manageable chaos into full-blown disaster. Drew sat me down one evening after a brutal Sunday shift, his hands shaking slightly even as he tried to act casual, and told me that my dad had reached out to him directly again. Apparently, Harold had invited him to meet for coffee under the pretense of wanting to clear the air, and Drew, ever the optimist, had gone, thinking maybe there was a chance to find some kind of fragile truce for my sake. Instead, he found himself sitting across from my father at a Starbucks, blindsided when Harold slid a check for $15,000 across the table and calmly told Drew he could take the money, walk away, and never contact me again. I think I actually stopped breathing when Drew said it, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears I could barely hear the rest of his story. He said he pushed the check back immediately, told my dad he wasn't for sale, that he loved me, and wasn't going anywhere no matter how much money they threw at him. My dad had apparently gotten red-faced and furious, muttering something about how men like Drew always leave eventually, how it was better to rip the bandage off now before he inevitably hurt me worse later. Drew stood up and walked out without another word, but he hadn't told me about it right away because he didn't want to cause more stress when I was already barely hanging on by a thread. I felt so many emotions at once. Rage at my parents, heartbreak for Drew, shame that the people who raised me could behave so monstrously that I didn't even realize I was crying until Drew pulled me into his arms and whispered that it didn't change anything, that we were stronger than this. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't let them think they could get away with trying to buy my life like it was a business deal. So I called my dad that night, even though it was almost midnight, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone. He answered groggily, pretending not to know what I was talking about. But when I brought up the exact amount on the check and the coffee shop where they met, his voice shifted, got cold and defensive. He said he was just investing in my future, trying to protect me from making a choice I'd regret forever, that he didn't see anything wrong with offering Drew a gentle way out before things got too serious. I started screaming so loudly that my neighbor actually knocked on the wall, and Drew had to pry the phone out of my hand before I threw it at the window. I was shaking so hard I couldn't sleep, pacing our tiny apartment like a trapped animal, my mind racing with all the horrible things I wanted to say, but knew would only make it worse. The next morning, I texted my mom, desperate to believe maybe she hadn't known, maybe this was all my dad's doing. She responded almost immediately with a long paragraph about how they were concerned for my well-being, and that sometimes parents had to make hard choices for the good of their children. She said it wasn't about not liking Drew. It was about being realistic and planning for a stable future. I felt like I was going to throw up. They weren't sorry. They weren't even pretending to be sorry. They genuinely believed they had the right to interfere in my life because they didn't approve of who I loved. That was the final straw. I knew I had to confront them face to face. No more texts, no more secondhand conversations through my sister. So I drove over there that evening, heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs, and sat them down in the living room like I was the parent, and they were the unruly children. They started in immediately with the concerned faces and soft voices, but I cut them off, told them I knew everything, the bribe, the manipulation, the pressure, and that I was done pretending any of this was coming from a place of love. My dad tried to say it was just a test, that they needed to know if Drew was really committed, and my mom started crying, her go-to tactic whenever she felt backed into a corner. I didn't let them derail me. I asked them point blank what exactly about Drew made him so unacceptable. Was it that he wasn't rich enough, polished enough, born into the right circle of people? My dad had the nerve to say, "You deserve someone with connections who can elevate you, not someone who'll anchor you to a smaller life." And that's when I laughed, this hollow, broken sound I barely recognized as my own. I told them Drew had never anchored me, not once, that he lifted me up every single day, that he believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. I told them love wasn't a resume or a bank statement. It was standing by someone even when the world tried to tear you apart. That's when my dad delivered the ultimatum. Break up with Drew and come back to the family fold, or be cut off completely. No tuition, no phone plan, no health insurance, no safety net. I stood up so fast I knocked over a glass of water on their pristine coffee table and didn't even bother apologizing. I looked them both in the eye, the people who had given me everything material and taken so much emotionally, and told them that if they thought they could buy my loyalty, they clearly didn't know me at all. My mom tried to grab my arm as I walked toward the door, sobbing that she was only trying to protect me, but I yanked free so hard I nearly stumbled, knocking over some ugly, expensive vase on the way out. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see their faces twisted with disappointment and rage and fear, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of losing them. I was afraid of losing myself. Moving in with Drew wasn't some fairy tale where everything magically falls into place just because you love each other enough. It was brutal and messy and exhausting in ways I hadn't even known to expect, like how sharing one tiny room above the coffee shop he managed meant we could hear every customer's order shouted through the floorboards starting at 6 every morning, or how we had exactly one closet between us and had to keep half our clothes stacked in plastic bins under the bed. We couldn't afford real furniture, so we ate dinner sitting cross-legged on the floor using a cardboard box as a table, and every time it rained, the corner by the window leaked just enough to soak whatever unlucky item we had stacked too close. But somehow, through all of it, we found a rhythm that made the chaos feel almost bearable. I worked mornings at the diner, afternoons doing freelance design projects squeezed into whatever time I could carve out, evenings trying to finish my senior projects without collapsing from exhaustion. Drew worked double shifts at the store and picked up side gigs wherever he could, helping a buddy move furniture, fixing up a neighbor's broken fence, running errands for an elderly lady across town who paid him mostly in banana bread and occasional $20 bills tucked into envelopes. We didn't have time or energy for big romantic gestures, but he'd leave little notes in my backpack telling me he was proud of me, and I'd sometimes drop off a coffee at the shop with his favorite ridiculous motivational quotes scribbled across the lid. The real turning point came about a month into the madness when the owner of the record shop, Mr. Hawthorne, pulled Drew aside and told him he was thinking about retiring. The business wasn't worth much on paper. Inventory outdated, building in rough shape, barely scraping by month to month, but he wanted it to stay in the hands of someone who cared about it, not some developer who'd gut it and slap a Subway or vape shop in its place. He offered Drew a ridiculously cheap buyout price, like the kind you'd think only existed in made-for-TV movies about small-town miracles, but still way more money than we had. Drew didn't even tell me about it at first because he figured it was impossible, but when I found the papers folded up under our mattress one night while hunting for clean socks, I forced him to explain. We spent hours sitting in the dark, whispering back and forth about the possibilities, about how insane it was to even consider buying a dying business when we could barely afford groceries, about how maybe, just maybe, it could work if we scraped together enough from small business loans and begged every contact Drew had ever made. It was the first time in weeks I saw that old fire light up behind his tired eyes, the dreamer side of him that the past few months hadn't completely crushed yet, and I knew we had to try. Even if it failed spectacularly, at least it would be ours, not handed to us, not approved by anyone else, just ours. While Drew threw himself into trying to make the shop a reality, I somehow managed to survive finals without completely losing my mind. There were nights I slept under my desk at the design lab because the buses stopped running before I finished my projects. Mornings when I showed up to work in the same clothes I'd worn the day before because there simply hadn't been time to go home and change. I lost track of how many times I wanted to quit, to crawl back to my parents and beg for forgiveness just so I could breathe again without feeling like I was drowning. But every time that thought crept in, I remembered the look on my dad's face when he said Drew was an anchor dragging me down, and it filled me with enough stubborn rage to push through another day. Somehow, against all odds, everything started coming together at once. Drew secured a tiny loan from a local credit union by sheer force of will and relentless paperwork, enough to finalize the buyout. I landed a junior designer position at a boutique firm downtown thanks to a professor who vouched for me. Part-time at first, but with the promise of full-time after graduation. We found a slightly bigger apartment only a few blocks away from the shop, still tiny, still with questionable plumbing and neighbors who blasted country music at ungodly hours. But it had a real kitchen and enough space for Drew to build a makeshift office corner for all the paperwork he suddenly had to deal with. Graduation itself was surreal. I didn't invite my parents, couldn't bear the thought of their polite clapping and fake smiles while pretending they hadn't tried to destroy everything I cared about. Instead, I sat with Drew's mom, Sharon, who had flown in from Montgomery with a suitcase full of homemade cookies and a hand-knitted scarf she insisted I wear even though it was 85 degrees that day. She cried harder than anyone when they called my name, snapping pictures with an ancient flip phone and waving a little hand-painted sign that said, "You did it, Callie," in glittery blue letters. Afterward, while we ate greasy tacos from a food truck because we couldn't afford anything fancier, Drew pulled me aside and pressed something small and heavy into my hand. It was a key to the record store, officially ours now, complete with a crooked little smiley face sticker he'd slapped on it, because he knew I'd lose it otherwise. I think I cried harder then than I had at any other point during the whole miserable, wonderful year, clutching that stupid key to my chest and laughing through the tears while Drew kissed the top of my head and promised that whatever came next, we were in it together. The first few months after graduation were a blur of chaos, trying to juggle my new job with helping Drew revive the shop, repainting walls at 2 in the morning because it was the only time we both had free, learning how to stretch every penny so far it practically snapped. We lived off instant noodles and discount produce, made furniture out of milk crates and cinder blocks, celebrated small victories like getting the broken heater to work again or managing to pay rent on time without overdrawing our accounts. There were days I wanted to scream from the sheer exhaustion of it all, nights when we fought over stupid things like whose turn it was to do the laundry or who forgot to buy more toilet paper. But somehow, we always ended up curled together on the sagging couch afterward, apologizing through half-asleep kisses and promises to do better tomorrow. Meanwhile, my parents continued their bizarre campaign of emotional warfare from a distance, alternating between icy silence and occasional texts pretending nothing had ever happened. My mom sent birthday cards with passive-aggressive notes tucked inside about how they missed having me around. My dad emailed articles about successful entrepreneurs who married within their social class, as if it would change my mind. I ignored them most of the time, not out of malice, but because every interaction left me feeling like I'd been sucker punched, like they were trying to pull me back into a version of myself I had no interest in being anymore. The final confirmation that we were really, truly free came one evening when Drew and I sat on the floor of our new apartment eating spaghetti straight from the pot, because all our dishes were still in boxes. He clinked his fork against mine in a mock toast and said, "To the absolute mess we made, and to making it ours." I laughed so hard I nearly choked because he was right. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't glamorous, it wasn't anything my parents would ever approve of. But it was ours, every scraped knuckle, every sleepless night, every tiny victory stitched together into something real and fiercely, stubbornly ours. I honestly thought my parents would eventually get tired of the silent treatment and move on, convince themselves I was a lost cause and focus their energy on my younger sister instead. But they proved me wrong in spectacular fashion about 4 months after graduation, when they suddenly popped back into my life with the emotional equivalent of a nuclear bomb disguised as an olive branch. It started with a handwritten letter, which felt almost quaint considering they usually preferred sending long, guilt-tripping emails, and inside was a folded check for $4,000 made out to me, along with a note from my mother saying they were proud of all I had accomplished on my own and wanted to help ease my burdens now that I had matured enough to understand the real world. It would have been laughable if it hadn't made my stomach churn with anger, because tucked between the syrupy praise and faux concern were the real expectations, barely hidden at all, about how now that I had proven my independence, it was time to come home, mend fences, reconnect with our community, and start thinking seriously about my future. Which, of course, meant ditching Drew, moving back to their neighborhood, getting a job through my dad's contacts, and marrying someone who could offer me stability and respectability, preferably before my 24th birthday, if I wanted to stay marketable. I stared at the check for a long time, feeling the old fear and temptation rise up in my chest, the part of me that still craved their approval even after everything they had done. But then I thought about sitting on the floor of our crummy apartment, eating spaghetti out of a pot with Drew, and how that had felt more like home than anything my parents' money had ever bought me. I mailed the check back without a note, without an explanation, because there was nothing left to say that I hadn't already screamed into the void 100 times. A few days later, my dad called, furious that I had insulted them by refusing their help. And when I calmly told him that love with strings attached isn't love at all, he accused me of being brainwashed by Drew, of throwing my life away for someone who would never be good enough for the dreams they had sacrificed so much to give me. I told him that maybe their dreams were never mine to begin with and hung up before he could respond, blocking his number afterward because I couldn't handle the cycle starting all over again. Meanwhile, life with Drew was still far from easy, but it was finally starting to feel stable in a way that didn't depend on my parents' approval or bank accounts. His record store wasn't turning a huge profit, but it was slowly building a loyal customer base, especially after he started hosting open mic nights and local band performances that turned the dusty back room into one of the only affordable venues left in town. I moved into a full-time position at the design agency after a few months of hustling on every freelance job they threw at me. And between the two of us, we managed to scrape together enough savings to start thinking about the impossible, buying a house. It wasn't much, a squat little fixer-upper on the edge of a neighborhood that everyone else in town still called up-and-coming, with an uncomfortable laugh. But it was ours, cracked sidewalks, sagging porch, weird mystery stains on the ceiling and all. We put down the deposit with trembling hands and wide, terrified grins, signing the papers like two kids playing dress-up in adulthood, both of us half convinced someone would show up at the last minute and tell us it was all a mistake. Moving in felt like the beginning of a new chapter, one we wrote ourselves without any approval from anyone but each other. A messy, chaotic, beautiful story stitched together with late-night painting sessions, arguments about whether we could afford real furniture yet, and long talks sprawled on the floor about everything we wanted to build together. Of course, the universe wasn't about to let me have a clean break that easily. A few weeks after moving in, my mom called out of the blue, her number popping up on my phone while I was standing in line at the grocery store with a cart full of discount pasta and off-brand cereal. Against my better judgment, I answered, more out of morbid curiosity than hope, and braced myself for whatever new guilt trip she had cooked up. Instead, she launched into a teary monologue about missing me, about wanting to be part of my life again, about how she and my father had reassessed their approach and realized they might have been too harsh, that they were willing to meet me halfway if I was willing to be reasonable. I didn't say much, just listened with a sinking heart, because I knew that reasonable still meant playing by their rules, still meant pretending Drew wasn't part of my life, still meant twisting myself into knots to fit a mold I had shattered months ago. When she finally paused for breath, I told her calmly that I loved them, that I hoped someday they could accept the life I had built instead of mourning the one they had imagined, but that I wasn't willing to compromise who I was just to make them comfortable. She started crying again, saying it was cruel to cut off family over a boy, and I hung up before I said something unforgivable, fingers trembling as I tossed my phone into my purse like it might burn me if I held on to it any longer. The final real confrontation happened on a Sunday afternoon a few weeks later when I decided to rip off the last bandage once and for all. I video called them from the living room of our little house, Drew painting trim in the background, the walls still half finished, and the floors littered with drop cloths and old coffee cups. They answered, looking startled and a little wary, and I wasted no time flipping the camera around to show them the house. The deed with our names on it pinned to the fridge with a pizza magnet, the piles of books and paint supplies and mismatched furniture that made the place feel alive even in its half-finished state. I told them that this was the life they thought Drew would ruin, that this was the happiness they had tried to buy off with a check, that every single thing they saw was something we had fought for with bloody knuckles and sleepless nights and a kind of stubborn love they clearly didn't understand. My dad, predictably, sneered that it looked humble and warned me that hard times would come and I'd wish I had taken their help when I had the chance. My mom just cried silently, hand pressed to her mouth, eyes darting around the screen like she couldn't process what she was seeing. I ended the call before they could say anything else, heart pounding but lighter than it had felt in months, maybe years. There was no big explosion, no dramatic reconciliation, just the quiet finality of knowing I had chosen my own path, consequences and all, and that they could either find a way to love me as I was or watch me live my life from a distance. Some days, that knowledge still hurts more than I like to admit, especially when I see other people laughing with their parents, planning weddings or holidays or baby showers without a minefield of old wounds lurking under every conversation.